good evening. Hope everybody's doing well tonight. Students in the room, that's a relative question. Are you doing well or not? Less than a week to go? So I think we'll get there now. This is our last honors evening of the semester and of the academic year. And for all the work that so many have done, we appreciate it very much. And some of you have been here almost every time. We appreciate you. Three presentations tonight, and in order it's going to be Luke Harbison, hails from Alabama. He's going to be looking at the history of the dollar, know what makes the dollar valuable at all, and do that through a history of currency. Caleb Schmidt, who is a junior in psychology, will be looking at the matter of atheism. We're hoping he comes down on the side against atheism. He's for it. Well, I'll talk to him later. But he'll be looking at the philosophical background for atheism. Mike Chandler is our third presenter tonight, looking at the value of music, the beauty of music. So Luke, why don't you get started?
Hey guys. In my paper I talked about what money is, the nature of money, and looking at that through the lens of the evolution of the US dollar. So tonight I just want to talk more about that. So I've got this dollar bill, and what gives this value? And you guys can actually answer if you want to. What gives this dollar bill value? Well, yeah, it's actually a hard question to answer because it's hard to really determine the intrinsic value of this piece of paper. See, I can't really eat it. I'm not really going to, if there's not a lot of nutritional value, I won't be able to burn calories and use it as fuel. Can't really build anything with it, it's too flimsy. It's a piece of paper, but I can't really even write on it because it's not very good writing material. So what really gives this value? So according to the economist Carl Menger, money has evolved in a series of stages. Different regions and different pockets have all used different systems of money, but there's been a general trend in how that money develops. So it starts off sort of as a collectible, right? Somebody identifies something that might have aesthetic value, and so they keep it and they kind of hoard it. Well, over time, those things become a store of value because we're always looking towards, we want to preserve our wealth and maybe pass it on to the next generation or something along those lines. So we're looking for some way to store value over a period of time. And so money goes from a collectible to a store of value. And then to a medium of exchange. What is a medium of exchange exactly? Well, that's basically, it's a means by which we facilitate trade and make transactions. And so I don't typically, ask for a cup of coffee in exchange for an energy drink, right? Rather, we denote that transaction in terms of, in this case, a dollar bill. So that's what a medium of exchange is. And then money transitions from a medium of exchange into a unit of account. And this is really interesting. So all the items on the market, goods, services, and whatnot, are priced in terms of something external and more objective. And so whatever this is becomes a way that we collectively, as people, measure value. And so that's what a unit of account means. And so for us, that's why in this country the buck tends to stop at the dollar, because for us everything is priced in terms of dollars. And that's why it's not priced in terms of fractions of Bitcoin, for instance, because Bitcoin can be seen as a store of value, it can be seen as a medium of exchange, but it's not a unit of account. Oil is not priced in terms of fractions of Bitcoin. So with that being said, as we kind of examine that historical arc from money starting off as a collectible to being a unit of account, there's been certain properties that have just become associated with the money that's chosen. So one of those properties is scarcity. So scarcity, I mentioned this in my paper a little bit, it's dictated by supply and demand. So it's So basically what happens is the demand for something outstrips the supply. And that's because oftentimes the supply is limited in some way. Another property of money is transactability. And I've talked about this already. This is what makes the money as a medium of exchange possible. So one property that kind of allows for a good way to satisfy transactability is divisibility. So that dollar that I had can be reduced down into smaller denominations like quarters, dimes, nickels, pennies. And online, theoretically, you could break it down more. Gold could be melted down and reduced into smaller and smaller quantities, although that's not very convenient. Another way that facilitates transactability is it's universal recognition, or just that I could go anywhere in the world and they would accept my form of currency. So I could go to California and use a dollar. I could go to Russia or China and exchange my dollar for their currency and use it there. So it's got to be universally recognized and accepted in order for it to be good money. Another thing is fungibility. It's got to be fungible. That basically just means that the items have to be self-similar. So every dollar is basically the same. Now, criminals have to launder money. And that's because the dollar isn't actually perfectly fungible. Gold pretty much is. You can always melt it back down and remold it and whatnot. A final property of money is durability. And we might not think about this very much, but anthropologically, there have been societies that have used money that's not very durable over time. So they've used like beads or seashells or snail shells, and over time, those have physically deteriorated. So clearly that's not going to be a good, for instance, store of value over time. So those are some properties of money that we need to keep in mind. What I ultimately want to talk about here is how did the form of payment that we're using right now, this currency, ultimately become, as I discussed earlier, a piece of paper that doesn't really have a lot of intrinsic value, right? Or maybe no intrinsic value. How did we get from money evolving over this span of time from a collectible to unit of account? How did we get from there to this currency that's not backed by any real asset or commodity? So during the Revolutionary War, the US issued something called a Continental Dollar. And the time frame is interesting because war always puts some sort of stress on the economy. It's a financial stressor for countries, and so what countries have to do is expand their public debt by creating more currency, expanding the money supply, or by issuing bonds or something along those lines. And so they raise money, and that funds the war effort. What this reveals then is this kind of tension between the necessary fact that countries must raise money, issuing bonds and whatnot. But at the same time, what that does is devalue the intrinsic value of a currency. So in the case of the Revolutionary War, the Continental Dollar that they were issuing ultimately became devalued over time until it just became worthless. So what happened next over the course of our history is that we issued coinage that was made up of like silver and gold, so it had some intrinsic value. Then we also had a banking system that was a bit disparate. It operated autonomously for the most part. And so they weren't able to really like pull reserves together and then by that lend money at scale. So credit then was restricted to these very like regional pockets. It was local. What they did is they issued banknotes that were redeemable for some sort of, like for gold or silver. For most of our history, we've been on a metallic system. And so the banknotes themselves were not valuable, but they were backed by something that was. The issue with this system, well, really what I'm kind of dancing around is the idea of a gold standard. And the issue of a gold standard more generally is that credit is kind of restricted because you're you're always, you've always got to issue out like dollars or banknotes or whatever to some ratio of gold that you have in reserves. So that's great for the intrinsic value of a currency, but during times of crisis, you're not able to meet the demand for liquidity that might be demanded by the market. So take the American Civil War, for instance. We ran into a big problem where money basically dried up. And I mentioned this statement in my paper by Adam Smith, where he said, like, no cry is more common than the cry for a shortage of money. And basically he's saying that liquidity dries up, and when that happens, like everything, there's like widespread deflation, so there's not enough money to go around, and so the economy just stagnates. So in order for the U.S. in the Civil War to basically fund the war effort, it had to figure out a way to create more money. And so it created a currency that was not backed by anything. It was called a greenback. And it was a fiat currency. And so what fiat means is, I've already said the definition a few times, but it's just issuing a currency that is only backed by faith and trust in the government. It's not backed by an asset like gold or silver. And so that was a greenback. That's what they used to fund the war effort. After the war ended, the US issued a series of deflationary policies that by 1879 brought banknotes back to being able to be converted into gold. In this case, it was $20.67 an ounce. And this stayed the case until 1933. So we were on this gold standard. But again, we had problems with credit. There were recessions, stock market crashes, and the fundamental reason was the fact that the banking system couldn't accommodate the demand that was the demand for money in the economy. So we weren't growing as fast as we could. This all kind of centers around a very a mainstream school of economics called Keynesian economics. What Keynesian economics says is that the primary engine of the economy is demand, right? Demand for goods, for products. It's consumption of those things that really drives economic growth. So sometimes in times of crisis, for instance, you have to artificially stimulate growth by expanding credit, lending out money, so that you kind of get out of that crisis, out of that recession or whatever it might be. And so, so that's what Keynes said. Now, this is really the crux of the matter, because if you have to define money, you can really say that it's composed of two things. It's a medium of exchange, like I was just talking about, and a store of value, like I've also been talking about. But the issue is that to be a great store of value, you can't really inflate the currency, right? In fact, the best store of value is deflationary. And so that's what's going to preserve your wealth over time. On the other hand, the way to stimulate economic growth is to expand the money supply so that there's more dollars chasing more goods. So people can take out loans, mortgages, buy houses. Companies can get loans to hire more people to innovate within their companies so that they can be more efficient and offer more products that more people can buy, right? That's growth, but it's inflationary. So how can money satisfy both of these properties? So one very, very critical event happened in 1971, and I talk about this in the paper. I give a little bit more context than I might be able to right now. But the US at the time had been on a gold exchange standard, and what that really means is that domestically we were just using dollars. Like, we weren't really using gold or anything like that, but a foreign country, a foreign central bank who had dollars in its reserves could demand from the Federal Reserve that it redeem those dollars for gold. And the dollar was actually pegged to a fixed exchange rate of $35 an ounce. So what this did then was it allowed for a lot of elasticity in the money supply, But the U.S. still had to honor that redeemability. And it just turned out that there was so much demand for liquidity in the international market. And the U.S. was funding a lot of things overseas, like the Marshall Plan, and they ended up running a trade deficit. So there was so much demand for U.S. dollars that they just could not maintain that ratio of dollars to gold. And so what President Nixon did in 1971 was suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold. This is how we get the system that we have today of money that's not backed by anything. How we transition to a fiat standard. So there's a lot of implications of this, but some people say that a fiat currency system is basically going to pave the road to inflation, to really volatile boom and bust cycles, to unemployment and all these bad things. Other people say that it's necessary. It's what we had to do in order to match the rate at which the economy wanted to grow. So that's my presentation for you guys. Thank you all.
So Luke, you're telling me I can't have it all. So
I think so.
I don't like that at all. Just kick the mic to the floor. The balance that you're talking about, the amount of money, the supply money has got to be balanced by the worth of the currency then, right? And the amount of money in the economy affects the worth of the currency. That's what it comes down to, correct?
Right.
Because there is gold and silver somewhere in vaults, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there's some hard metal that actually does back the dollars that we use digitally or not. It was 83 cents per dollar. I think it's probably down more like 80 or 81 cents these days. What a dollar is actually worth, but we all accept it as a dollar. We go to Chick-fil-A tonight, we give them a dollar bill and tell them it's only worth 83 cents, they all laugh at us. But it's only built on confidence. So much of it's confidence. So Noah, you have a question or comment? You got this figured out?
Yeah, the history of currency that you kind of laid out was interesting. And what kind of caught my mind was the first one that you said is just like kind of like a collection thing. And that made me think of kind of modern things like NFTs and cryptocurrencies. Is there some sort of regression going back in the form of currency that people are, kind of jumping on the bandwagon of, or is that just something that an affluent society has the money to be able to do?
I don't know if I would describe it as a regression, but it's possible you can kind of conceptualize it that way. It's interesting to me that I guess like more stable and more prominent cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin and Ethereum kind of do satisfy some of those other evolutions. But yeah, there's things like NFTs that essentially are just collectibles. They arguably don't hold any intrinsic value except for just some sort of aesthetic appeal. So yeah, that's I think that would satisfy the definition of a collectible and all that. So.
Well, what makes a cryptocurrency worth anything? We accept that it's worth something, right? And because of calculations done by supercomputers and whatnot, that you can come up with so many calculations to get a Bitcoin issued. And so people bid on them. But it's based on what you believe it's worth. I don't believe it's worth a whole lot, so I don't invest in Bitcoin. Other people invest thousands of dollars. And so it's an outside form of currency from national currencies because you don't believe fiat currencies will last long term. So people are investing in some other kind of currency, extra national. So that's a good question. I mean, is it really worth anything? Right. Hannah?
Yeah, I guess my question kind of goes along with what Noah's saying, but I was just thinking about how, especially since COVID, we've been using cash a lot less. People are like, oh, we want to use Apple Pay and like contactless payment so we don't have to touch the money and stuff. And I was wondering, I guess, pretty much the same thing, just in the future, do you see cash going away and then, I don't know, really anything?
Yeah, I think we definitely moved towards that, and I think it's a natural evolution of things because I mentioned transactability and money satisfying the property as being a medium of exchange, and transactions that are electronic can happen almost instantly, and so it's a much more efficient system than trading cash. In fact, that gets to a property known as the velocity of money. So just how fast is money moving through the economy? Of course, I don't know if like cash will disappear entirely, but it does seem to be the case that we use cash less and less, and there's propositions to create central bank digital currencies like CBDCs that would definitely put cash out of use.
China's moved to a digital currency, for instance. So, but you can manipulate that, see, that way, easier.
I thought you did a very good job, and it was interesting how the use of currency is kind of built upon this collective promise that I guess we make to each other that we're going to pretend it's worth something in a way, and how, like, just the levels of trust within a community that requires to even come about is really interesting. My question, and maybe this is kind of the obvious question coming off of what all you said at the end, in your opinion, do you think it was a mistake or the right choice to move away from the gold standard?
Yeah, I think that is the $1 million question. There's just issues on both sides. I do think the gold standard was unsustainable in the form that we had it. Yeah, that was also the Bretton Woods system, and it just, there's something called the Triffin dilemma, and I think I did mention it in that paper, but I might not. That basically demonstrates why that gold standard system was fundamentally flawed, and it has to do with maintaining the exchange rate to gold while the supply of dollars was increasing. And so, to me, that the gold standard was bound to fail. At the same time, there's fundamental issues with the fiat currency system, like the tendency for the Federal Reserve, which basically has a monopoly on credit creation, to just continue to inflate the money supply. So I don't know of a better system, honestly, but it's falls on both sides.
Say gold system's bound to fail because
There are restrictions on credit. You just can't you can't meet the demand that the economy has for dollars.
so if we could increase the amount of gold as opposed while the population's increasing at some sort of percentage, you could still have gold standard because the population of the country's doubled since the early 60s. The amount of gold we have is not doubled, so there's no way to do that over time. So it becomes unstable. Micah?
That idea of currency not being backed by anything made me think of just the national debt issue and how it's increasing every day. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on maybe what the final result of that would be.
Yeah, I just don't know. So we can sustain a trade deficit as long as people keep buying our debt. As long as people keep buying U.S. Treasury bonds. The reason that would stop is if our debt to GDP ratio increased to a height that people decided that it was too risky to take on the debt of the United States, basically. So until that happens, I think we're good. But if it ever does happen, then we're probably not good.
Hallie?
This is kind of a curiosity question. What do you think would happen to the current economy if we did go back to a gold standard system?
Well, there would be a lot of deflation, and we would see that in prices. First of all, the price of the commodities would all go down. I think on a more fundamental level, innovation would slow down. And in my personal opinion, innovation is what drives the economy. Just more companies creating more products that allow people to do more things. And so if we went back to a gold standard, I think we would see a very quick contraction of credit, meaning dollars would get sucked out of the economy, and so there wouldn't be as many dollars to go around to do more things like that. So the economy would certainly stagnate. That's I guess what I would think. But of course, it's all counterfactual, for sure.
Anybody know how we define money really in the economy? How do I define it for you? It's like blood.
M1.
Yeah, it's like blood in the body, right? If you drain the blood out of a body, right, you don't have high blood pressure, but what do you have? A dead body, right? You drain the money out of the economy, you go back to a gold standard, you drain all those dollars out, it's what Luke describes. You don't have money for credit. What do you do next? Cryptocurrency probably booms is what happens next. So Yeah, it's one way to lower the money, or lower inflation is to lower the money supply. Question is the balance and all that. And that's the role the Federal Reserve plays, which is what Luke's gotten to in some of his work. So, yeah, good question. Knowledge?
Well, talking about money really stresses me out a lot. But I really enjoyed learning about it from you and learning about the history from you, and I think you did a really good job putting it all together, and you clearly know what you're talking about. So I'm very impressed by you. Whenever you asked, so I don't have any questions, but I have thoughts. But whenever you asked at the beginning, what is this dollar? What is this? My first thought was about how society needs structure, and it needs a concept of value to establish the you get what I'm saying, the hierarchical nature of society. We need something that says, you have a thing that is worth more value than my things, and so you're cooler than me, and you're my boss, and you're my king, or you're the president, or something. And so I was thinking about that, and kind of what Hannah was saying, moving to a cashless system after COVID, and thinking about how in our societal structure today, poor people don't have crypto, poor people barely have credit cards, and so I'm just thinking about how cash now is kind of being treated like a nuisance, like working in the food industry, when people hand me cash, I'm like, okay, you hate me. And now I have to count out 98 cents or whatever. So that's just what I was thinking about, is how people are visualizing cash now is changing, and I was interested in if your presentation would have continued after 1971, what you would say about how we view the money system now and how that's kind of transforming.
Yeah. So, do you mean like how things have evolved since 1971?
Pretty much.
Okay. Well, like fundamentally, things haven't changed because it's still a fiat currency system. I mean, I guess there's different ways I could go about answering it, but I mean, the Federal Reserve has taken like a very active role in terms of like alleviating, recessions or times of crisis and things like that. As far as like the evolution, like what you were saying with like cashless systems, yeah, we definitely have moved more towards a cashless society, and I wouldn't be surprised if that should continue for sure. I think we're at an interesting time right now because of the introduction of cryptocurrencies and all the possible digital forms that might take.
Now, you all grown up during a dangerous time, because you bring up a good point. The only way we got through 2007, or 2008, 2009, the financial crisis, was to issue bonds and have our own government buy them. You're buying your own debt. Now, what are the limits there? And so we've tried to we tried to divest ourselves of that. But that's a very dangerous thing. You're running a great risk there. And we've got away with it because we're still the world standard currency. But it's a good question as far as cashless society versus not. Riley, good question?
Thank you for your presentation. I was thinking about how it can be really hard, like kind of like she was saying, to feel the weight of the cashless money that we have, when you can send a Venmo and not really see the drawback or the money being taken out of your bank account, because you can't feel yourself like no longer having $10 in your wallet. So is there anything that people on a more smaller basis can do to like help that balance the economy and keep it strong when it feels like such a big, grand, full nation problem, or just something that's not really in our control?
It's a good question. So one thing that you said reminded me of a trend that I've seen, like graphically, you can empirically describe the trend. Since 1971, we've been saving less and less, actually. And if I had to speculate, I think it's because the value of the dollar is going down at a faster and faster rate. And so that incentivizes borrowing rather than saving. I don't know I don't know what individuals could do on that level to change things macroeconomically. I guess I think investing in long-term sustainable assets, like the assets that appreciate slowly over time, like gold, for instance, over other things. But yeah, I don't know. It's a good question.
And we expect you to solve that one. Yeah, Alice?
So you mentioned that there was widespread deflation in the U.S. and that deflation can store value and inflation can cause growth. And if I'm understanding you correctly, would you suggest that a stagnant money would be the best, or do you think that deflation would be preferable to inflation, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's an interesting dilemma of sorts, because if we inject if we double the amount of currency in circulation, then prices double, and that means that our purchasing power halves. So these things are inversely proportional, but they both have good effects and bad effects. I don't think a system of stagnant money would be good, because you'd get you wouldn't get either benefit. I think the system that we have now is all right, because the Federal Reserve does control the money supply, and I mean, I guess I'm sure lots of people would disagree, but in a relatively decent way by adjusting interest rates. So they can raise interest rates in order to increase the value of the dollar, because that restricts banks from lending more money, so more dollars are taken out of circulation. On the other hand, they can lower interest rates, which does decrease the purchasing power of the dollar, but it allows banks to lend more, and so we get more money chasing more goods. So I think that system is honestly all right, but again, y'all had all the good questions about whether it's sustainable over a long period of time.
Anything else? Allison? No? Riley, anything else for you? Natalie? No? Howard? Micah? Anything? Okay. Anna? No. Nothing else on your mind? Nah, it's all you're worried about now is when do I get out of college? You get to make this worthless money. The Spartans had an iron currency. They didn't want people to have money. They wanted to defeat materialism. And that was the way they did it. It was hard to carry, hard to exchange, and that focused people more on national service than it did on their own personal wealth. I don't think we'll ever go to that, but that kind of gets to Allison's central question. Any questions from the audience? Comments? Karen?
I have a question about the Federal Reserve. Who's in control of that?
That's a complicated question. So the Federal Reserve is both private and public. So what that means practically is that there is a board appointed by Washington, D.C. officials. I think it's 5 to 7 people. Right now, Jerome Powell is the chair of it. And that's the group of people who are in control of setting the interest rates and also stepping in and doing open market operations like what we did in 2008, where we basically, bought our own debt through a thing known as quantitative easing. On the other hand, the Federal Reserve banks individually are actually private. And so it's like a system that kind of satisfies a fear that was around at the time of the institution of the Federal Reserve in 1913, which is we want a system that's both centralized and decentralized kind of at the same time. So we had the centralization aspect with the government being involved with it, but the decentralization aspect is seen in the fact that each individual Federal Reserve bank, at least nominally, is private and it's kind of its own entity.
But aren't we then trusting a few people who are kind of pulling the strings for the economy and money, and they have the control?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very precarious system. I agree with you. Because, I mean, among a lot of other things, there's sort of economists over the years, like Hayek is the one that comes to my mind, who says that no group of human beings can actually accurately set targets like interest rates, because there's so many variables in the economy. It's such a complex system that you can't actually predict where the rate should be set at. And so when you do have an organization that's doing it rather than, say, the market correcting itself, then that that puts tons and tons of pressure on those 5 to 7 people. On the other hand, I don't know of a good alternative.
It's an unelected board of overseers for the economy. And the chairman serves so many years in a term, the president either reappoints him or not. But it's from San Francisco, Philadelphia, New York, Atlanta, the major economic centers where you have the Federal Reserve governors at. And from those Federal Reserve banks, you have the distribution and effect of money to banks at interest in an overnight rate. And the banks then turn around and charge us interest. So the Federal Reserve ups their rates for interest and increases all our rates of interest, which affects everything from their, car loans to student loans to you name it. And so it changes a lot. The housing market's down this year because it's so expensive to buy a house, and that's why. They're trying to deflate, the currency. There's too much currency in the economy because they injected so much after COVID and during it. And now you're trying to pull, in effect, currency out, in a sense, and slow the economy down. Question is, do you pull too much money out, kill the patient, right? So do you inflate the economy enough, cause a recession, and that really slows things down? Or do you kind of tamper down on interest rates to keep it going? You can see the Federal Reserve like a pacemaker, that if you think about the human body as the equivalent there. It's hard to function without it for us. Now, what else? Question, comment? Yes, ma'am.
I'm going to be showing my ignorance here. I was just wondering, how does our system compare to other countries? And, I don't really understand how we came to be like the standard for everybody. It seems like we're on the verge of losing that. And is it because of our debt?
Okay, so how we compare to other countries, everybody's on a fiat standard, just about everybody. And that happened all in 1971. Everybody went to floating exchange rates at that point. Everybody's got pretty much a central bank doing, I believe, a similar sort of thing. Now, when did we attain that status? That was at the end of World War II, when Europe was just completely ruined by the war, and we kind of became like the financial powerhouse of the world at that point, kind of because we had to. And then on the verge of losing that status, again, there's always speculation around that. Right now, one key metric to show that maybe we're not on the verge of it is the fact that, is the petrodollar. The fact that, oil has to be bought exclusively by the dollar. If something like that changed to, say, the Chinese yuan, then I would say you're probably right. We're probably losing that status.
A couple of South American countries have converted to dollars for their national currency because they've so wiped out their own currencies. You can go to most countries and they'll accept a dollar on the street still, because the dollar is assumed to have worth, even though it's fiat currency. So we're probably not in great danger yet. So, what else? Question, comment? And without a Federal Reserve, you get all kinds of crazy things. We didn't have a central bank, really a central bank. We didn't have a Bank of the United States from Andrew Jackson until 1913. And so you had wild swings in the economy. And when the Confederates tried to fight the Civil War, they had an inflation rate of 9,000%. So they just cranked out the money. So it was worthless. So, all right, sir?
Do you think that it's become that the government as a whole, the federal government, has become too large, and that plays a large factor in how money is regulated, as compared to when the country was started? There were a lot of people who really wanted to keep the states themselves and run by themselves and more for the people. Do you think the federal government has just exploded, and that maybe a cutback on that could stimulate growth?
Yeah, I think you're probably right. I do think that, at the beginning of the nation's history, states even had their own currencies, which is really interesting. There needs to be some uniformity, and that comes about through some centralization in a larger government. On the other hand, this also goes to your question, too much power concentrated in one place does create a bureaucratic system, and that does slow things down. So you could definitely make a case for if the government was smaller, then things would get more streamlined and that would stimulate some growth.
Also goes to tax policy, doesn't it? And the mixture of politics and the economy. Last questions? All right, well, thank you very much, Luke. I'm always a little nervous when we talk about things like that because I'm afraid you go to Waffle House later and your meal's going to cost $5 more. Inflation's taking hold. Our second presentation tonight is on atheism. Right? So Caleb Schmidt's going to present to us on some of the philosophy and literature that pertains to atheism. So come on up.
Good evening. In my last Honors Evening presentation, I examined the psychology of belief in God, showing how humans are cognitively predisposed to think in a theistic manner. I showed that by rejecting the natural and inescapable proclivity to think theistically, atheists must accept that their brains are not trustworthy and that they are incapable at arriving upon truth or meaning through intellect and rationality. In this Honors Evening presentation, I will again directly confront the faults in an atheistic worldview, this time from a philosophical and literary perspective. I will do this by examining the atheistic philosophical worldviews of humanism, rationalism, and nihilism as portrayed within the characters of Dostoevsky's brothers Karamazov and Crime and Punishment. Through this examination, it will become clear that the rejection of God leaves someone with a worldview incapable of providing meaning or creating morality, and causes all to become deeply lost without direction or answers. Fyodor Dostoevsky was a Russian existentialist writer in the 1800s. He's very famous for his ability to create profoundly true and resonating psychological characters. His books allow readers to explore how faulty philosophical or psychological beliefs will ultimately play out through our lives. During the period of Dostoevsky's writing, several atheistic philosophical and political movements were on the rise. However, Dostoevsky vividly saw where these atheistic worldviews would lead, and what the consequences of their wide acceptance would be, both on a psychological, philosophical, and political level. For many, this turn towards atheism at that time was due to the observation of the evils and suffering within the world. Many suggested that the solutions to the problem of humanity was to reject God and rely upon man's rationality and intellect in order to create a utopia here on earth. Dostoevsky, however, understood that murdering God within society would not lead to a utopia nor remove evil, but instead it would simply remove the only viable antidote we have to evil, which is Christ. The validity and profound proof of Dostoevsky's philosophical lessons are best displayed through his prophetic abilities. Incredibly, Dostoevsky's works foresaw the unrest, despair, wars, hatred, and starvation that would later unfold within the atheistic nations of the 20th century, such as Maoist China, Soviet Union, or Nazi Germany. So therefore, by examining his characters, we will explore the results of these godless worldviews, display the impossibility of actually living out the dictates of atheism, and most importantly, learn that Christianity and the belief in God is essential in the ultimate search for meaning. In The Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky delves into the complex yet essential existential task of finding meaning within one's life. In this story of three brothers, Ivan, the eldest brother, seeks to fulfill his desire for meaning through his prideful leaning on rationality and intellect. Ivan tells his younger, deeply religious brother, Alyosha, that the impotence for his lack of faith is founded in his inability to accept a God who would allow for evil and the suffering of innocent people. Ivan believes the burden of responsibility placed upon the Christian to find love, hope, and peace amid this suffering, and to live according to God's will despite the evil all around,
was too much for any man to actually bear. So Ivan's pride causes him to believe that he knows better than God. He would rather have his way and suffer than submit to God's way and bear the responsibility that comes with it. Much like Adam and Eve, he is lured away from God by the deceitful lie that he can determine what is good for him better than God can. Like the serpent in Paradise Lost, Ivan would rather live in a hell where he can at least pretend to be in control than submit to the order of God. Ivan's acknowledgement of the pain and suffering of the world is correct and undeniably true. However, Ivan's turn away from God because of it only leads him towards a worldview that is entirely far worse at handling the philosophical problems than the route of faith is. He is led to the damning realization that he is incapable of finding truth, goodness, or purpose outside of God, because his intellect is simply too limited. He is led, the standard of rationality does not exist within one's own mind and will, as Ivan would like to believe, but instead exists within the external and objective order and truth of God. To put it simply, Ivan cannot find meaning or truth away from God, because without God, truth and meaning do not exist. Ultimately, Ivan becomes riddled with indecision and horror and can never take a definitive side regarding the essential issues of faith within his life. Ivan's inner turmoil and moral conflict cause him to become overwhelmed with doubt and drive him into an existential psychological state of paralysis. Ivan comes to recognize that the consequences of a worldview without God are far too much to bear. He is unwilling to actually follow through and live out the dictates of his atheistic worldview. He might claim to be an atheist, but in action, he actually commits to nothing. He cowardly lets life play out around him and never takes decisive action. So the story of Ivan teaches us several lessons regarding the ultimate conclusions of an atheistic worldview. Dostoevsky shows that under an atheistic worldview, humans are incapable of confidently trusting in anything. Rejecting God means the rejection of all truth, order, and stability. Ivan becomes utterly lost in the world of chaos. He is both unwilling to submit to God and unwilling to commit to his self-constructed, godless worldview. Similarly to Ivan, Raskolnikov, the main character from Crime and Punishment, rejects God in favor of a humanistic and nihilistic worldview. But unlike Ivan, who is horrified by the conclusions of this worldview and succumbs to indecision and despair, Raskolnikov actually chooses to live out the dictates of this worldview. Convinced that God is not real and morality and meaning are therefore self-definable, Raskolnikov arrives at the conclusion that murder can become justifiable. He decides that he can rationalize his own structure of morality and live according to his own will. He believes that the only reason ordinary people do not commit murder when they can get away with it is because they are weak and are held down by society and their foolish submission to the limits of religion and belief in God. Dostoevsky in this book creates the perfect scenario in order to thoroughly test this materialistic, rationalistic perspective. Raskolnikov discovers a pawnbroker with a highly valuable collection of jewelry who is, by his and society's standard, a despicable and worthless human. He has every reason to gain for killing her and stealing her jewelry, and because he is a poor, starving university student, and his mother and sister, who are dependent upon him and live far away from him, his sister is about to marry a man that she does not love simply in order to provide for Raskolnikov. So Raskolnikov, under his self-defined morality, would not only be justifiable in committing this murder, but is actually now morally obligated to do so. Killing her would be justice for the community, save his family, and allow him to receive his education, which he can use to, in some way, bring a good to the world. So Raskolnikov musters up the courage to break free from these moral and societal bounds and murders the woman with an axe and steals her jewelry collection. But to his shock, he entirely gets away with the deed, having no trace back to him. However, things do not go according to plan for Raskolnikov when he realizes that the punishment for his sins becomes more than he can bear, as he is unable to ever escape his own conscience. He quickly discovers that the act of murder changes him as a person. He is no longer the same afterwards. He is riddled with shame, guilt, paranoia, and moral anxiety. He cannot carry out his plan, and he quickly hides the money afterwards, not wanting anything to do with it. Raskolnikov finds that he does not actually have this ability to create his own moral standard, nor does he have the courage to fully live in this rebellious state. He spends all of his time after the murder trying to run away from his sins and return to who he was before. Raskolnikov embodies a Cain-like spirit, rejecting the path of sacrifice required from God, and instead trying to become his own God, creating his own moral standard and path toward fulfillment. Raskolnikov, like Cain in the book of Genesis, realizes after his murderous act that the consequences of his sin is that his soul and mind will now be forever cursed to wander without rest nor satisfaction. In Genesis, we observe what Cain spoke to God after hearing this fate, declaring, "My punishment is more than I can bear." Unwilling to ever accept God's order unwilling to accept that God's order is the only path towards morality and meaning, Raskolnikov is confronted with the inescapable truth that he will never be able to find peace through atheism. No matter how far he goes down this Faustian venture, he will forever wander further and further off the true path towards meaning. Ultimately, the spiritual and psychological contradiction within Raskolnikov's mind torments him to the point of break. He eventually confesses his crimes to the police, and in so doing acknowledges that he was unable to truly live out this self-defined moral standard. He finally realizes that the only way to restore his sanity and conscience was to resubmit himself to the moral dictates of society and God's order. It is easy to see how Raskolnikov could think that if there is no God and no objective moral standard, humans could create their own ideas of value, meaning, and justice. After all, if God is not real and man was in command of his personal meaning and morality, then why would one not be able to choose what will make him happy, what will give him meaning or peace? Nevertheless, we all know that this is not true. We cannot simply live according to our own hedonistic pleasures and malevolent desires. No matter how hard we try to reject God and his order, there is only one path towards meaning, one form of truth, and one standard of good and evil. If we do not submit to God's standards and accept his boundaries, our souls will be corrupted like Raskolnikov's, our consciences will cry out, and our lives will fall into disorder and suffering. So from observing Ivan and Raskolnikov, we can observe that living out the mandates of an atheistic worldview is impossible. Through Ivan, we observe that man's intellect is incapable of reasoning our way towards meaning. And in his attempts to use rationality to reason and create his own world better than God's, he becomes paralyzed as he is unable to confidently arrive at truth due to the limitations of his own intellect. Further, an atheist must deny that order and design put forth by God in this attempt to create his own. Through Raskolnikov, we see how, despite all of his efforts, it is impossible for man to self-define his own morality and meaning. The order set forth by God supersedes ours. Whether we agree with, understand, or accept the path that God has set in place, the boundaries he has designed will ultimately supersede our own. So the final answer to these existential questions raised by Dostoevsky's writings are found in the character of Alyosha. The younger brother in Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov is the antithesis of Ivan's intellectual rationalism and the prideful nihilism of Raskolnikov. Unlike his elder brother, Alyosha seeks to find meaning through his devotion to the Christian faith and his love for others. Ivan's reliance on himself and his intellect is juxtaposed with Alyosha's dependence upon faith and his humble focus on others. Ivan is overcome by questions of fear regarding the suffering of evil in the world, and he decides that if he cannot understand God's order, he will simply not accept it. Alyosha, however, does not claim to know the answers to all of life's problems, nor does he choose to question God. Instead, Alyosha responds to the pain and evil of the world is to choose his response to the pain and evil of this world is to choose to be the solution to the other people suffering around him. Alyosha does not desire to resentfully meditate upon this perceived unfaithfulness of the world or become overridden by indecision, not knowing what to believe in. Instead, he loves others selflessly, and he devotes himself to faith. Unlike Raskolnikov, who pridefully decides he can create his own morality and become his own God, Alyosha submits himself to God's will. Ivan and Raskolnikov assert that if they cannot understand God's creation, God must be the one at fault. However, both of them learn through their descent into further suffering, they learn that the ultimate problems of life are found within themselves, not God. In the final analysis, we will all be confronted by suffering and evil in our life. Ivan asserts that he cannot believe in a God who would allow for this pain, but what he ultimately learns is that pain and suffering are much worse without God. If our understanding of evil leads us towards total despair and a rejection of God, then our worldview is philosophically corrupted. Instead, when faced with the world's malevolence, we should be pointed towards the ultimate good that is powerful enough to defeat it. Alyosha understands that he does not know the answers to why God allows suffering, but what he does understand is that the true meaning of life can only be found when we give up our dependency upon our own intellect and rationality, and instead choose to live in faith. Ultimately, faith is the willful choice to believe that truth and goodness of God will overcome evil and suffering and bring our lives meaning and fulfillment, even when we cannot rationally understand how. When faced with the evil of life, Alyosha is not led towards resentment. Instead, he chooses to bear up the suffering of others. Ivan, Raskolnikov, as well as all of us here, have every reason to be resentful, bitter, unbelieving, and nihilistic. However, Dostoevsky's conclusive warning to his readers is, choose to act out a philosophical worldview based upon those feelings at your own peril. Your life will deteriorate quicker than you could imagine, your soul will become corrupted and destroyed, and most of all, you will be left without meaning, morality, and order. Therefore, we must choose faith in our search for meaning. There is no alternative. It is not found in our rational reason or created by our intellectual power, but it is found through our submission to God. The atheistic worldview, by rejecting God, rejects the sole answer and path towards peace. Atheism does not remove evil from the world, remedy suffering of humanity, or provide meaning. Instead, it is an attempt to flee from the realities of God's world and an unwillingness to accept his design. The message of Christianity ultimately is that suffering and evil do exist, but the solution is not found in running from it. It is found and the meaning of life is directly tied up in our willingness to stare malevolence in the face with the confidence and faith that we can overcome it through God. In the end, why do we suffer? Why does evil exist? Did God create man or did man create God? Well, I cannot answer, nor can Dostoevsky answer any of these questions. My intellect and rationality will never be capable of satisfying these questions. Nonetheless, I can have confidence in knowing that goodness can overcome evil, that meaning is found in responsibility, and that if we choose to bear up our crosses, taking the responsibility for the sins of the world, we can be the antidote to evil.
Thank you, Caleb. He is a man of his time, isn't he? He would have been in his early 30s when Darwin's theories were published, and so certainly some of that's going through his mind when this is written. Let's see, Allison, let's start with you. Question or comment?
I really like the way that you put these two stories together. I think it's very clear all the correlations between them. I I was just wondering about the end of the story with Ivan. I believe that you mentioned that he was just paralyzed for the rest of his life. Was there ever any redemption story with that?
So I didn't have time to fully explain the story of Ivan. What ultimately happens is there's a servant in his father's house named Smirnikov who he, throughout his childhood and adolescence, kind of instills these atheistic beliefs into. And Smirnikov, in his resentment and hate for the world, ultimately uses this rationality of Ivan to justify murdering Ivan's father. And then Smirnikov commits this murder, and Ivan is placed in this situation where morally he can't actually condemn this action. And furthermore, his brother Dmitri is the one who is ultimately punished for this crime. And basically, in the courtroom, Ivan falls into a state of unconscious psychosis where he is unable to coherently provide the evidence that he has. And the story ends with him kind of being taken home without any resolution of whether he'll overcome it or not. If that makes sense.
Typical happy Russian piece of living. Okay. All right, Riley?
Your presentation was really good. I've been teaching the baby class in church recently, and it really made me think about the song that we sing, the wise man built his house upon the rock, foolish man on the sand, and how a lot of these characters definitely are choosing the sand, their own intellect, as you said. So I was thinking about how we use those simple songs or images for the babies to help them kind of, just have that in the back of their mind. So has it been helpful reading the stories that this man has written about the problems of atheism to kind of think about it and be able to explain it to others?
Yeah, I think, the way that he writes these stories is he kind of uses these characters as a way to teach these philosophical lessons. I think humans are made in such a way that we understand these deeper meanings through story. That's why God gave us the Bible rather than just a simple iteration of all of his laws. He uses stories to show us that. And so I think the reason Dostoevsky's stories resonate so well is because through his characters we can see how truthful they are, that these characters embody these beliefs that are all around us, and they point towards their incapability of providing meaning. And I like your analogy of the wise man and the foolish man. I hadn't thought about that, but that's very true, that through atheism and the rejection of God, we try to build our worldview upon something that is unstable. There is no rock that we can secure it to, because ultimately the only rock that we can secure our worldview to is Christ.
Heather?
I thought you did a really beautiful job. I thought your conclusion was beautiful, and I really enjoyed listening to your thoughts. So thank you. I'm a Bible major, and so I've been thinking a lot about atheism over the last school year, and an alarming number of biblical scholars in the field today are agnostic, and a smaller number of them claim atheism. And that is scary to me as somebody who wants to work in that field. And I think it's because at some point, whether you hold a Christian worldview or an atheist worldview or an agnostic worldview, you have to kind of choke down some absurdity at some points, and you have to choke down some cognitive dissonance with some points. And that can be a really scary thing, because how can humans be this capable if it just kind of happened and there was no God? But also, how can God become a person and then die? That's a tricky one as well. So it's really delicate and difficult. And I was thinking about how sometimes in Christian spheres, atheism and atheists can be painted in a very extreme picture and capacity. And so I was wondering two things. I was wondering if you had come across literature or philosophy in your research that doesn't use such an extreme example and argues for atheism in a more reasonable way. And I was also wondering if since there is a more atheist world now, will we, you don't have to know the answer, but kind of your thoughts on, will we swing back to that if Dostoevsky's conclusions about an atheist life are true? Will we swing back to a more Christian world?
So to answer the second question, hopefully, but I think there is no limit to how evil and corrupted the world can become without God. That the creation of hell on earth or the rejection of God has no ultimate pit, I think. So ultimately, I think maybe you could view society as it kind of fluctuates back and forth between faith and unfaith. But it's, I guess, not possible to predict at what point will we hit rock bottom and swing back up. Yeah, but I think to answer the first question as well, I mostly focused on just Dostoevsky's work, and obviously he does use kind of extreme examples of this, and so I think in our lives these things play out maybe to a lesser extent. I don't think any of us are going to murder someone with an axe, but I think we all do commit crimes against our conscience with the same belief that we can determine morality better than God can. And I think that's the ultimate theme. While it may not play out to the same extreme in our own lives, I think in all of us we can see how we reflect those atheistic beliefs from time to time.
It's a good question. And from the antediluvian world to this hour, I mean, there's no moral vacuum. You're going to decide to live your life based on something. And so I think that's what he tries to draw. And when you draw the extreme examples, then you're doing that to make a point, which is what he does. So, Luke, any question, comment?
I really enjoyed the talk. So it seems to me that Raskolnikov, Ivan, and I'd be interested if you think that the Underground Man from Ghost of the Underground also embodies the same archetype. They're all very individualist characters, and they all go down this route of nihilism, which takes them to certain places. On the other hand, you said that Dostoevsky was a prophet, and that he kind of predicted some of the things that would happen in Nazi Germany, Soviet Union, and so on. So it seems to me that on the one hand, there's the road to nihilism that people take once a society or an individual rejects God. On the other hand, there's the road to totalitarianism. So I was wondering if you thought about that and considered the implications of, rather than going down a nihilistic pathway, you would make the state your God instead.
Mm-hmm. No, that's very interesting. With the Notes from Underground, my original plan had been to do those 3 books, Notes from Underground, Crime and Punishment, Brothers Karamazov, and I just didn't have the space to incorporate all those thoughts. But I think that book particularly hits upon those themes that you just discussed. While in these characters we see more of a psychological portrayal of what happens in the individual when we reject God, I think the Notes from Underground and some of the first half in his kind of ramblings, if you will, he shows how the rejection of God on a state level also leads to deterioration. We see in the Soviet Union this idea that if we reject God, we can elevate rationalism to the ultimate good, or our idol or God, if you will. And that because of that, that belief is undergirded with the idea, as the man from the Notes from Underground says, that human beings are simply piano keys who, through rationality, can simply be aligned properly to fit their perfect function and create harmony and a utopian society. And his conclusion is that man is ultimately completely irrational. That the first thing man would do if you were to create this utopian society where they had nothing to do but eat cake and enjoy themselves is they would break something so that they could prove that they are not piano keys, so that they could prove that they do have will. I think also, as you were talking about, there's another inclination to elevate the state into the place of God. And I think we see this in partly in the book of Genesis with the story of Exodus, of how so the Israelites are under tyranny in Egypt. And when they escape tyranny, many of them wish to return. Because in some ways, when you are free from tyranny, you bear all the responsibilities of the sufferings of the world. And you have to act upon that. But when you're under tyranny, all of that's alleviated from you because you are in submission to the tyrants. And so I think there is a desire, however, though, to return, to go under tyranny and in escape from God. However, we see that ultimate freedom and salvation is only found in freedom and the bearing up of your own responsibilities.
I don't think there's ever been a Christian totalitarian dictatorship. I mentioned that the foundation of Christianity is liberty.
Mm-hmm.
It's your choice. And so it's no accident that where you find Christianity, you found more liberal, to use the classical term, more liberal societies.
Mm-hmm.
And you find that in the West, not the East.
Yeah, and I think it's obvious that every society that has tried to place atheism at its core goes straight towards tyranny.
Yeah.
But the only society that we actually have that results in ultimate freedom is the society of the West, which is predicated on the idea that humans are inherently valuable. But if you cannot arrive at that conclusion without God, and with atheism, you result in societies that claim that humans are only worth something in their affiliation to the group. Which results in a whole lot of other problems that maybe I could give another presentation on.
Yeah, making us into little mechanisms, I suppose. Hallie?
I think you did a great job with your paper and presentation, and I just had a comment about a connection you made about Ivan believing that the burden on Christians to find love, hope, purpose in a world amidst suffering and chaos and evil, that it was too much to bear. And then at the end of your presentation, you mentioned that we can only bear everything in this life through Christ, and that our submission to God and following His will is the reason why that we're able to do all of this. I really like that point.
Yeah, I think Ivan, in his discussion with his younger brother, he claims that it's not even that he rejects, that he doesn't believe in God, it's that he thinks the burden that God places on mankind to live as Christ did, to bear up the sufferings of the world and seek to be the antidote to that, is simply impossible for humanity. But I think through the Bible we see that it is possible if we can depend on Christ, and that ultimately He did the ultimate form of that by taking all of our burdens and dying on the cross for us, allowing us this path towards salvation.
Micah?
Just a comment, this in your last talk just reminded me of way back when we read the Common Reading in the summer, and just how this ideology that leads to the murder of women, that leads to complete mental breakdown eventually, can creep in through things like elementary English textbooks, that start denying things like objective value. And while that, that grain of it might not necessarily be the same thing as the full product, taken to its end, that's what it leads to. So I just appreciate you talking about that, and it reminded me of that.
Extra points for remembering the Common Reading. That's good. Hannah?
I don't know how much of this you're going to have an answer to, but I was just curious about Dostoevsky as a person, like in his personal life. Did he have something before he wrote all of this that pushed him to write this? And then do you know any reactions to his writing in his time while he was alive? Because I don't imagine that it was super positive.
Yeah, I guess I don't know the full bibliography, if you will, of, or biography of Dostoevsky. I do know, I struggle to remember. He did have some things in his earlier life that, do you know Noah?
Yeah, I think he was in, he was some sort of he was part of some sort of anti-Russia group, or he was at least characterized as being that, so he was sent to a Russian prison camp where either one of the few or the only book he had access to was the New Testament, and he kind of read that and took those principles and applied it to what he saw around him. And then when you go to the Brothers Karamazov, that's why there's so much New Testament allusions and quotes and philosophy and theology in there, is because he had so much time alone in a Russian prison work camp that he just poured over the New Testament. That's kind of what developed a lot of his thoughts and his philosophy.
That's exactly what I would say.
No, do you have a question?
Yeah, I was scared Mike was going to steal my comment when he mentioned the abolition of man. But Raskolnikov, seems to characterize the theory of the Übermensch that Nietzsche came up with, and I don't know if Dostoevsky wrote Crime and Punishment before or after Nietzsche put that idea out there, but it's interesting. The Übermensch is the guy who's so powerful that he can kind of create what is moral and what is ethical around the actions that he does, and he can transcend society and God, and that's kind of what Raskolnikov tries to do, but it doesn't work out in the end. And it's interesting, going back to Abolition of Man, Lewis specifically points out that moral systems that are created by Nietzsche and like Marx and those sorts of writers and thinkers are just innovations on top of the moral system that was put in place by God. So that rejection of moral systems is built on top of the moral system that they're rejecting. Is kind of circularly defeating itself.
Yeah, which is why in the end Ivan is simply paralyzed. He has nowhere that he can go because there is no path forward once you reject God. I think, to go back to your point of Nietzsche, I think some people have basically said that Dostoevsky is like Nietzsche in fictional form. His writings are. And I think we see that theme of this idea that you cannot simply will your way towards meaning all throughout literature, because it is such an archetypal theme throughout humanity. See it in Goethe's Faust, and Satan in Paradise Lost, and in the story of Cain and Abel. I think throughout the whole literary, throughout all the literature of the West, that theme is clearly prominent.
Nietzsche writes within 10, 15 years of this, The Triumph of the Will, ironically, or fittingly, was the name of the Nazi propaganda film in the early 30s. And the worship of the state that we were talking about, it all ties together. You can't live in a moral vacuum. And so something's got to be substituted. If it's the state, and if it's the human will, well, then where does that go? If I believe I create my own morality, well, it leads to the Holocaust. That's what it leads to. Darwinists will back up so quickly they trip themselves to get away from responsibility, but that's what it traces back to. The Nazis just reheat an awful lot of ideas and take them up to a boiling point. Anything else? Anything else? No?
Yeah, it's interesting, the implications of the atheistic worldview. And Caleb touched on it last semester when he talked about, science and knowledge and epistemology, and he's talking about it now, and it's talking about just, like consistent living and how you can have a consistent philosophy. It's interesting how those implications kind of go, like, on one hand, the implication of pure atheism and materialism is that, evolution has created us all the way up to here, and then that would imply that survival of the fittest is still, at work, and then at that point, what grounds does an atheist have to deny racism, slavery, genocide, eugenics, stuff like that? And then on the other hand, that strict materialism kind of throws away free will, throws away morality, throws away truth, and then there's a consistent atheist. It seems like, especially through the characters that Dostoevsky's written, can't really be consistent about anything that lets a human live.
Anything else, Al? Micah? Allie? Allie, anything else?
Yes, I thought you said my name, that's why I took such a deep breath. Yeah, I read recently in a John Mark Comer book, but I know that he took it from somebody else, but I don't know who he took it from. But it said, that you don't choose if you worship or if you have faith or if you're a person that grows. It's you choose what you worship and what you have faith in and what you transform it to. So,
Yeah. In practice, or in the world around us, there is no atheist. It's simply different forms of idolatry, different forms of placing something as your highest good or your version of truth.
Right. Questions from the group? Insightful thought, question, sir?
Comment. Your whole talk that you covered very well about kind of the idea of having some sort of standard reminds me of a lot about what Paul talks about in Romans. He kind of talks about how, you know, the Jews had their standard that God gave them, but the Gentiles still had some sort of an innate standard in their conscience. And I think that's interesting because it's not that we have a conscience that we are intelligent enough to create our own standard, but more that God has given us the ability to find the right standard. And I think you covered that very well.
Anything else? Questions, comments? All right. Well, I'm glad you came down on the right side of the issue there. Well, we have money, which is its own idol, atheism, and Micah Chandler has our third and last presentation for us tonight, and that's on something a little bit different, beauty of music. So, Micah, come on.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Really appreciate it. So I'm going to be talking about music tonight. And part of what interested me in music is because it seems to be one of the most universally and constant obsessions of humanity. It's there about as far back as we can trace history. It seems so ingrained into the essence of what being human is music appreciation and music making. I mean, from the time of Moses, they're singing all the way through, to today. And it's obviously evolved and changed, but it's there. So before I get started, I'm just going to provide a brief synopsis of what music is made out of. It's essentially made out of 7 parts: rhythm, pitch, tempo, contour, timbre, loudness, and reverberation. And I'm not going to explain what all those are right now. You can ask me afterwards if you really want to know. But that's essentially what all music is made up of. And all those are auditory things. Most of them only auditory things. And from those things, we can combine them and get things like key, meter, harmony, and melody. So how can something made up of such simple parts, that's all sensory, all auditory, be so constant and such a huge universal obsession of humanity? And not only that, it affects us emotionally. How can something like that do that? That should be our natural question when we think about music. Why does it have that effect? And so music has had many uses throughout the past, and many people have given opinions on why music has this effect, and it's been used for very different reasons. We get what we might know as the beginning of music, or at least as far as we know, in Genesis, where it says Jubal, whoever that guy was the father of all who played the lyre and the pipe. That's the first mention of music we have in the Bible. In the Old Testament, after the kingdom was established, we have music at celebrations and temple worship and battle, even all celebratory events. We have laments that are musical. We have, of course, the book of Psalms. David, who was a hymn writer, even used music to calm the anger of Saul. In the New Testament, we have more secular uses of music, like Herod and Herodias, that famous story. There were dirge singers when Jairus' daughter died. Jesus himself even sang a hymn with his apostles. And that would have sang every time they would have gone up to the temple. That was a customary Jewish thing. So it's all throughout the Bible. And even before the New Testament, there's lots of talk about why music has this effect and what music is, especially in the thoughts of some of the early Greek philosophers, especially that of Plato. Plato prescribed to, or was influenced by the Pythagorean account of music, which we'll talk about later. But he really thought that music had a positive or negative effect on the soul of a person. Something sensory like music, like organized sound, could either be redemptive to the soul, could increase your virtue, or it could increase vice within you. And that was not only in reference to lyrics that music had. He references that in the Republic. He sort of condemns Homer for that, for glorifying vice, like Achilles' rage. But he says certain musical modes and certain musical scales, those sounds, certain sounds and sequences of sounds, can actually increase virtue. It can make you a better person, or it can make you a worse person. And that's because Plato saw music as a connection to the divine. He saw it as a connection to something higher, which is really interesting. And Aristotle agreed with him mostly, except that Aristotle sort of allowed for a little more room. He thought music did have a recreational purpose. It wasn't purely for this kind of soul increasing of virtue or increasing of vice. And Aristotle accounted for the kind of cultural delight that music can give, as he described it, what we might call an aesthetic experience. We get some sort of emotional effect from listening to music, and that's virtually universal. So after the New Testament, after those Greek philosophers, music quickly became a very controversial issue in the church, in the early church. There was lots of controversy over what kind of music should be used, whether music should be used at all, because what's the most important thing about worship? Is it the music, or is it the meaning of the lyrics that are being used in the music? St. Athanasius, one of the early church fathers, said that there should be no melody or harmony whatsoever in liturgical music, in worship music. Instead, he advocated for a kind of like singing, rhythmic chanting. There shouldn't be any melody because that distracted from the lyrics, is what Athanasius argued. So some people took this pretty far. Music shouldn't have anything to do with worship. Maybe rhythm is what they said, but not music. And Augustine, people like St. Augustine and Ambrose, had similar views, except they were a little bit more conflicted because they said, yes, there's been times when I find myself distracted from the lyrics because of the beauty of the music in worship, but there have been times that music has moved me to tears of repentance and confession. So there were a lot of people that were really confused about the place of music in worship specifically, and it got so far to the point, people were so divided and confused about this. There was some music that they said, okay, this is okay for worship. We can sing this music because this music, the harmonies and melodies, aren't so complex that it distracts from the lyrics, which they thought was the most important thing. But there is also the kind of music that is undeniably beautiful, but it's too complex and it's too beautiful, so it can't be used in corporate worship. So they made a distinction between those two types of music. You could still connect to the divine emotionally because it has an emotional effect. No one could deny that, which is really interesting, as much as they tried to. But they said we can't use it in worship because it's too beautiful, which I just thought was really interesting. And so, aside from the church, secular philosophers had all kinds of opinions about this. Some people thought it was just the lowest of the arts because they said, Immanuel Kant said, it's just sound. You can't communicate really any concrete concepts through sound. So it's the least of the arts. People like Hegel had a very different view, said you could really express true emotion. Schopenhauer, in fact, had a really influential view of music and said music, it doesn't just can't convey particular emotions like lyrics can. Lyrics can say I'm sad about this or I'm joyful about this. Schopenhauer claimed that music can communicate the emotions themselves. Music can communicate joy itself, anger itself, fear itself. And based off of that, he said that words are inferior to the music itself. So if there are words in music, they should play a subordinate role to the music itself. So this had a really influential impact on the music scene at the time in the late 1800s, and it influenced his good friend Wagner, who you might know is a very famous composer, who took this idea that music is the most important thing about music, believe it or not. And so he wrote operas, he wrote lyrical music, but his big thing was not concerned about some connection to the divine or virtue or vice. It was about drama, it was about tension, it was about big sounds and emotion. because that was the primary work of music, and it could do it in a more broad and fundamental way than lyrics could, is what Wagner thought. And which you might know, he was very influential on Hitler. In fact, Hitler said that Wagner was his one and only predecessor, both because of ideological views that Wagner held, but also Hitler specifically mentioned the sound of his music. He said you should, if you want to understand authoritarianism, you have to listen to Wagner, is what Hitler claimed. And that's just about the music, right? So that's clearly, even people like Hitler had a pretty high opinion of the things that music, pure music, could communicate. Another influential philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche, who was already talked about tonight, surprisingly had a very deep connection to music, and he was actually a really good pianist. And he said that, agreed with Schopenhauer and Wagner that music had to endure poetry. Poetry and lyrics were a burden on music, and in fact musicians were the redeemers of society. Tolstoy, another Russian like Nietzsche, was really ambivalent about music, like a lot of these guys, because he could not deny the emotional impact it had on him and the emotional effect it had on him, but he felt it was fictitious because it was out of his control. He really struggled to give authenticity to the emotions that music made him feel, because they were out of his control. And he was very pessimistic about the movement of his day. He lived during the Romantic era, very pessimistic of Beethoven, did not like performances of Beethoven, said they were elitist, that they were only for rich people, that people would get up and clap at the end, and he wouldn't understand why. And he said, you know, the voice of some poor girl is more beautiful than lots of these Beethoven pieces. And a lot of that was economic, a lot of it was just his own opinion. But at the same time, he admitted that music made him feel a certain way, and it was out of his control. And he wasn't sure how to feel about that. Sigmund Freud even talks about music. He never really wrote about music, but he did concede that works of art like music had a powerful effect on him, and he also explained what that was due to. And that really plagued him for a long time, and he said, in fact, the more he tried to account for it, the more he tried to account for this feeling that music gave him, the more he lost that feeling, in fact, because it didn't make any sense to him why something like music would make him feel a certain way. Throughout history, from the time of the Greeks to 20th century, music has plagued the minds of mankind and has been a source of confusion and mystery, and there's vast opinions about what its use is and what its purpose is. But nearly everyone, no matter how reluctantly, they admit that music has some tangible emotional effect on them. Even if they don't want it to, or they don't understand why, or they think it's inauthentic, they admit that music affects them emotionally in some way. Whether they think it's a connection to the divine, or they can't describe it. So how is it that music, and all of them ask this question, organized sound, a combination of sensory factors, how can that affect me emotionally in a way that's out of my control? And I think the answer to that question lies in what the origin of music is in the first place. Where does music come from, and why is it here at all? And I think if we look at that, we can explain maybe why it has such an effect on us. So there are two major theories of the origin of music, basically. The first one is the evolutionary theory, and the second one I call the spiritual theory. So the evolutionary theory was first put forth, not very surprisingly, by Charles Darwin, also talked about a little bit tonight. And Darwin himself, like all these other guys, notes the confusion that the effect that music had on him gave him. He has a quote in his book, The Descent of Man, "As neither the enjoyment nor the capacity of producing musical notes are faculties of the least use to man in reference to his daily habits of life, they must be ranked amongst the most mysterious with which he is endowed." So he said, man has some innate capacity to appreciate music and to be affected by it, and I don't know why, because it doesn't make any sense. That was Darwin's initial thoughts about music. But he also admits music arouses the emotions, except he denied that music aroused emotions like rage or horror or fear. And he claimed that music can only arouse what he called the tender emotions, like love, which is interesting. And so from these assumptions, Darwin concludes that music must have been used by our half-human ancestors, specifically during seasons of courtship, for the purpose of expressing excitement or jealousy or rivalry or triumph. That was the purpose of music. And further, Darwin argues that the capacity for music appreciation, like musical cadences and rhythm, actually probably would have had to evolve before the capacity for speech even could have evolved, because he saw musical implications in speech, especially in monkeys. He said monkeys make really high-pitched noises when they're afraid, they make really low-pitched noises when they're angry. So in fact, maybe the capacity for music appreciation had to evolve even before the capacity for language evolved. So Darwin sort of has a confusing opinion on music, at least in my view, because it seems that he accounts for the confusing but emotional aspects of music in confession, just him talking, but it doesn't really seem like it in his theory. Darwin basically said the significance we give to music evolved as a way to express emotions during courtship and charm the opposite sex. And he said that's plain to see in lower forms of life, just in less complicated manifestations. And so he claims, now, since we did that, since our half-human ancestors did that, well, that just became so ingrained in our evolutionary adaptation that now we just do it instinctively. Maybe not always for courtship, but now it's just instinct for us, and that's how it started out. And he says maybe even birds, he assumes, maybe even birds feel some kind of emotional effect when they sing, in a less complicated way than we do. And that's how he said, well, it's manifest in lower forms of life. So clearly it evolved from lower forms of life to where we are now. So that's not the only version of the evolutionary theory put forward. In the 90s, a guy named Steven Pinker famously sort of quipped that music evolved as nothing but auditory cheesecake, is the term that he used. He said that it just evolved as a byproduct, riding piggyback on other necessary evolutionary attributes. He said music just happens to tickle several important parts of the brain in a highly pleasurable way, as cheesecake tickles the palate. And so he came to that conclusion because he said, as far as biological cause and effect are concerned, music is useless. It shows no signs of design for attaining a goal, such as long life, grandchildren, accurate perception, or prediction of the world. Compared with language, vision, social reasoning, and physical know-how, music could vanish from our species, and the rest of our lifestyle would be virtually unchanged. So that was his view. He said there's nothing necessary to survive about music, so clearly it must be a mistake. It just must be something that rode on the back of things that we needed for evolution, like rhythmic body movements, like vocal cadences, things like that. And so music appreciation just came along. Well, as you can imagine, even by other evolutionists, that theory was not very well accepted, because it just doesn't account for the universality of music and the undeniable emotional effect, deep emotional effect, that even evolutionists admit music has. Even Darwin admitted that music has that effect. So the theory has become more organized since then. They deny that music is purely pleasure-seeking behavior, and argue that music is a legitimate evolutionary adaptation because it fulfills the 4 criteria needed for that. 1, it's widespread, it's universal. 2 is that it's been around a really long time, as far back as we can go. So it can't be auditory cheesecake if that's the case. The 3rd is that music requires specialized brain structures in order for us to understand it and comprehend it. And then the 4th is that they think that music in humans is analogous to music in lower forms of life. And so therefore we can say that it arose from a lower form of species. So they say because music meets those 4 categories, it must have an evolutionary origin. And also, they argue that music is something that shows your evolutionary viability, your ability to produce viable offspring, which is a key factor in any evolutionary adaptation. They say, well, in our half-human ancestors, 1, if you were a musician or a dancer or something of that kind, then you clearly had good physical and mental health. So you were a viable option to reproduce with. And 2nd, since there is no use for music to survive or create viable offspring, well, you must be very wealthy in the resources that you do need to stay alive, And so therefore, if you have enough time to get good at something, as useless as music is to survival, then you must not be worried about survival very much. So you must be a pretty viable offspring. So essentially, they argue that music evolved because it's useless to survival, which is, it's interesting. So I think there's truth in the evolutionary argument of music, but I don't think all that it postulates really accounts for the realities of man's experience with music. And I don't think even some evolutionists really prescribe to it either. And Darwin himself even lamented what he described as a loss of feeling for music in his biography. He says, "In one respect, my mind had changed during the last 20 years. Formerly, pictures gave me considerable, and music, very intense delight. But now I have almost lost my taste for pictures and music. My mind seems to have become a sort of machine for grinding general laws out of large collections of facts. The loss of these tastes, this curious and lamentable loss of the higher aesthetic tastes, is a loss of happiness, and may possibly be injurious to the intellect, and more probably to the moral character, by enfeebling the emotional part of our nature." So Darwin says he feels like he's lost a part of his humanity by losing his appreciation for music. And it's because he had the type of worldview that does not account for the emotional effect of music. And so the more he tried to find, and Freud expressed this too, like we said, the more he tried to find out why music affected him as it did, the less he actually became affected by music, and he lamented that. He said, it's a loss of happiness. It's a loss of part of my humanity, and it's a degradation of my moral character, even, and my emotional state. So I think the rational theory gives us a more complete picture, and that dates back, way back to Pythagoras, who is credited with finding harmonics, discovering harmonics. And Pythagoras' method for doing that started with a pitch. And basically a pitch, most of you, when you hear a pitch, you know it's a pitch, but a pitch is scientifically, it consists of the fundamental tone. So for example, let's say 110 hertz, A, 110 hertz. And then that pitch within it also has theoretically infinite overtones that are multiples, that are ratios of that fundamental tone. So within the pitch, A, 110 hertz, you have going up in the ratio of 2 to 1, 3 to 1, and 4 to 1, and so on, theoretically for infinity, other notes. So you have the next octave is the overtone, you have the fifth, and so on and so forth. Theoretically infinite tones in this one pitch. So Pythagoras is credited with discovering harmonics by taking two identical strings, putting them side by side together. They make the exact same pitch when they're plucked. And he took his finger and he put it halfway, on the halfway mark on one of the strings. So he cut the string at a ratio of 2 to 1. And then he plucked both strings together, and that made what we know as an octave. Notes that what we know now as 12 semitones away on a piano, we might say. So Pythagoras continued to do this in different spots, push down the string, until he came up with a series of tuning based on what he thought which notes blended well together and which notes didn't blend well together. So he came up with a 12-note system that's very much like our modern 12-note system. It varies a little bit because we've modified our tuning, our modern tuning. But that's where we derive our modern circle of fifths. That's where we derive our modern 12-tone scale, was from Pythagoras' discovery of these harmonies. And the important thing to note about this discovery is how really unscientific it was. It was basically Pythagoras saying, okay, these notes sound good together. They sound like they blend well, and these notes don't. And that's how he derived modern tuning, which I think has some pretty important complications. It's pretty astounding to think that pitches combined with their naturally occurring intervallic pitches innately sound good to the human ear. Because all of these tunings that Pythagoras came up with are in precise mathematical proportion to each other. They are in ratio to each other, relative to each other. And that naturally sounds good to the human ear. So this seems to be the first blow against the evolutionary argument, and that is that we didn't create music, rather. We discovered it. Music, as we know it, and as it was discovered, was here long before we knew it was there, even. And we just found out that it was there. So in this way, the origin of music can't be evolutionary. Only our use of music can. And only our further discovery of music can be actually evolutionary. The rules of harmony were discovered in nature. And I'm not trying to say you can't ever technically violate those rules. They're not, hard and fast rules. Depending on the context, you can. But those aren't just rules of music. They're laws of nature that Pythagoras discovered. And it's based on an appreciation that humans innately have. So this suggests there's some natural order in the music that we innately appreciate. We appreciate order, and we see beauty in that order that's in music. And the second objection to the evolutionary argument, I would argue, comes from something that the evolutionists themselves admit, and that's that music arouses the emotions. They say that, well, because music arouses the emotions, then it had to be used in courting, it had to be a factor in reproduction, but they never account for why music arouses the emotions in the first place. Why does it have that effect on us in the first place? Sure, it might have been used in mating, might still be today, might be a good way to express emotions, but why does it do that in the first place? That's something that evolution can't and doesn't even try to a higher intelligence. And the evolutionists seem to be aware of this, and that's why they're confused about it, and that's why people throughout the past have been confused about it. So I think man's constant obsession with music can't be accounted for by mate selection or pure pleasure, or even romantic love. I think it has to be a reflection of something. It has to be a reflection of order by higher intelligence. And it has to be the implantation of an appreciation for the beauty in that order. There's a reason that God commands us to sing hymns to him with music, not just lyrics or rhythm. So I think that the mathematical order of music and the beauty that we innately find in that necessitates a creator and refutes the evolutionary argument. Thank you.
Thank you, Micah. Which one? Was it Copernicus who referred to the music of spheres?
That was Pythagoras.
Pythagoras. Yeah, Pythagoras had his own religious cult about him,
Yes.
which is interesting. But even they understood. I mean, there's a ratio and there's a distance and all that with what we see in the sky. So there's a music of the spheres. There's something natural there. Luke, you have a question, comment?
I really enjoyed your talk. I was just curious because you said that that Freud, when he tried to analyze music and whatnot, or at least art, that he found himself not getting any pleasure out of it. And same thing with Charles Darwin. So I'm just curious about your experience. Have you ever found yourself analyzing music a lot, kind of reducing it down to some of its parts, and not really feeling it the same way, or does it allow you to have a deeper appreciation for it?
Yeah, and that's a good question. And I think in order to get pleasure out of music, ultimately you have to have the kind of worldview that allows for that, which I think is the reason why a lot of musical people, maybe they're not, they're kind of weird in their cosmological beliefs sometimes, because a lot of them believe in some spiritual thing, or at least claim to, or maybe they just take enough LSD that they believe in. But if you have the kind of worldview that denies anything divine, and says things are only for survival, and that if it exists and it doesn't increase our survivability or reproductivity, then it can't exist, and I don't think you can appreciate music. And I think that was the dilemma for Freud and Darwin, is that, well, I'm affected by music, but it doesn't make any sense. And I think that kind of thinking over time eroded that natural appreciation for music that they had. That's my opinion. But definitely in modern musicians, sometimes you can get caught up in some parts that you forget that music is primarily an emotional thing. As technical as it can be, it's emotional primarily.
Callie?
I really enjoyed your paper and your talk, and I just had a comment. I really liked the question about why does music affect us this way, and I wish I could know why it has this effect on our emotions, and I think that different kinds of music make people feel like two people may listen to the same song, and it makes each one feel a different way, and I'm just so curious about, why do you feel this way and I feel this way, but we're listening to the same thing. That's very interesting.
Why isn't everybody like the Allman Brothers? No, Dickie Betts died today. He followed the Allman Brothers. 80 years old. I was very sad. And I was, yeah. I texted my wife. I said, I'm in tears. I don't know if I can go on for that. All right. Okay?
Yeah, maybe I've just been thinking about these things for too long, but I think listening to your presentation, it kind of perfectly complements or brings forth the same ideas that I was talking about in mine, that there is an ultimate structure and order that God has placed forth that we cannot go outside of. The way that you were talking about how the beauty of music is directly correlated to these mathematical truths that exist outside of our own preference. It's the same as how I was talking about how morality and meaning are directly defined by God and we can't go outside of that. Just in the same way that you can't justify murder or something, you also can't say, I'm going to find, these particular sounds beautiful, even though nobody else does. While there is preference, you might like this type of music, I don't like this, there is still an objective order to music that certain things are beautiful and certain things are very much not beautiful. And that just points to the fact that God has designed the world in a perfect way, and we're incapable of actually deviating from that or defining our own standards.
Yeah, and that especially comes out in music, and I didn't mean to say at all that dissonance is bad, or that we don't appreciate dissonance. And sometimes, we need dissonance in our music. If our music was just a series, we'd never have any resolution in any song if there wasn't dissonance first. You have to sort of have some tension before you have some release, right? So, and people use that all the time. I think the example used in my paper was Beatles: A Day in the Life, when they have like 1 minute of just every instrument going up chromatically from the lowest note they can play to the highest note they can play. Doesn't make any, harmonic sense at all, but that's the point. And it's just a minute of that complete chaos, and it makes you really tense. And then there's silence for 1 second, and then there's this giant resolute chord, which is the root of the song. It's in that key. So it's all this tension and then this release, and we innately feel that. So dissonance can be really good sometimes, but you're right. If there's no resolution, people aren't going to hang on to that for very long because it doesn't make any sense to us.
What's interesting is after we were talking about with Nietzsche and all the writings of the 1890s, and relativism and pragmatism that come out of that same era, you have discordant music that's produced within 30 years. And by our very natures, kind of reject that. It doesn't sound beautiful. But people are drawn to it because it's the difference between that and what they see as too harmonious almost. There's this kind of pull some people have to discordant music. It's really distasteful when you listen to it. But it's no accident. It comes after that period of time when everything is being questioned and all those standards are being thrown out. Again, you can't live in a vacuum. Something takes its place. So it's that awful music, which is awful, right? So, Anna?
Yeah, I thought you did a really great job. I just had a comment about how much of a blessing it is that we can even hear music. I was in neuroscience last semester, and we talked about auditory systems in the ear and all of that stuff. It's so complex, and the fact that God blessed us with the ability to hear it all is really cool. And I think that's something we take for granted with how much we listen to music. I was thinking about that as you were talking, how much me personally, I listen to music like all the time. I constantly have music playing when I'm studying, when I drive in the car, when we walk into a store, when we walk into the pouch, they're playing music most of the time. Like, it's just everywhere. And I enjoy that. I love having music playing. I love listening to music. And then I got back to thinking about what you said about the early church fathers saying that it was distracting. And you talked about the beauty of music being distracting, and it made me think of stuff that you've talked about and that Noah's talked about beauty, no matter what it is, should point us back to God. And so I just thought all of it tied together really well.
I like what you said about just how much we listen to music today. There's a story of Bach walking 200 miles to this one cathedral because he knew this one guy that he really wanted to listen to was going to play there. We just don't understand that kind of thing today. And so, yeah, it's definitely something we take for granted. I don't know, if I would go to that, probably not, but it is a good point.
Thomas Aquinas said that beauty is what is in due proportion. Do you know if he specifically addressed music, or maybe if his views were influenced
Yes.
by the discoveries of Pythagoras or anything?
Yeah, he definitely did, and I didn't mention him in this, but I mentioned him in the paper. He was very much sort of the Platonic mind that if music was used well, specifically lyrical music, he was concerned most with worship music. If it was associated with good virtues, then its influence for good was great. But if it was paired with antithetical virtues, or vices, antithetical virtues, vices is what they're called, then it had the very opposite effect. It could be degenerative, actually. So that's all I found in my research. There's probably more. I know he wrote some books just on music too. So it's probably more.
I think you do a really good job. I think you're a really wonderful speaker, and I love it whenever I have the opportunity to listen to you speak. You always do wonderful. I have two thoughts. My first thought is I thought it was funny that early church fathers rejected music because of its complexity, and now here we are trying to sing the greatest commands and Magnificat, and when you try to do that the first time, it's real tough. So I was thinking about that. But my second thought is I was wondering about how music would affect a mind that's not like totally developed, like a child. Because I was one of the children whose mother made them learn piano and violin, and having your first callus when you're 6 is a grueling experience. But I knew when I was 6, like I'm playing a happy song or I'm playing a sad song, and you could like hear the chords and how they made you feel. So I think that's super interesting of like how mothers will sing to their babies. So I just wonder like what's going on in the mind of a baby who hears music.
Yeah, and babies in fact have physiological reactions to music, emotional reactions. A little bit more ability to comprehend and understand music, even if you've just had a small amount of music lessons as a kid. Your corpus callosum, the front half of your corpus callosum, which connects your two lobes of the brain, is bigger, and that has to do with parallel processing and stuff. A lot of your cerebellum is bigger, which they think they're starting to figure out that has a lot to do with emotion in music, and it's activated pretty heavily when you listen to music. Your auditory cortex gets bigger and builds more neurons. So yeah, there's definitely physiological effects to listening and learning music as a child, which is really interesting.
Your presentation and paper was really well done. Music is such a cool topic because you can just keep going with it. And I thought your paper and presentation showed that because you talked about mathematicians, you talked about the science of like the wavelengths, the physiology of our reactions to it, and the psychology, because you mentioned like Freud and how all those people that, and just how we think about music. You mentioned nature, all of those kind of things. So I just find it cool how music really flows in everything. And so I feel like that's one reason that we can all connect to it, because you can find something, anything you're doing, you can find a connection to music. So anyways, I just thought that was cool. And then my second thing, going back to what you said about how we get to hear it, I think it's always so cool when you see like a deaf person who participates in music, because they can't even hear it, yet somehow they're still able to enjoy like the vibrations and that kind of thing. So I just find that stuff cool.
Anything else, Rob? No? No what? Yeah? Caleb? No? Nothing. No monetary meeting of music. No. Yeah, it was interesting. You mentioned Wagner. You know, the Israeli Philharmonic Orchestra won't play Wagner to this day because Wagner is so closely associated with the Nazis. So Wagner was no Nazi because he died before they came to power, but Spanish Nazis. So found that interesting. What else? Question, comment, sir?
Just a couple of comments about this, because I know you looked a little more at the physiology of our hearing itself and how that is adapted to specifically respond to music. That's not an accident.
Right.
When you really look at that deeply, it is a powerful evidence. Somebody designed this to work the way it does.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
the second piece is the math. It's definitely connected mathematically to all kinds of things. And it speaks to something that existed before humans existed, which is another powerful evidence that mind came first, not matter. So it's powerful stuff, and I think you could build on what you've done, and, you know, it'll take a lot more time and effort, but there's a lot more to it.
Thank you.
Great job.
Oh, you're biased.
Slightly.
Yeah. You know, it is, I was gonna mention it, the connection between music and math, they say that kids that take more math, or take more music, are usually a little bit better at math. No accident there. I played trombone for 8 years, it didn't help me. But, you know, at least, you know, there are those connections, very definite connections. Anything else, ma'am?
Just another connection with language. Apparently people who play piano or play anything musically are better at learning languages too.
Sir?
Yeah, when I was trying to learn Spanish, I talked with the director of the Bruton School of Language in Cincinnati. He said, I need the kind of course, if you have one, where I can make maximum progress in a minimum amount of time, basically. He said, well, let me ask you, are you musical? I said, yes. He said, well, what we've learned is that the ability to pick up a language is directly proportional. It's all a matter of rhythm and cadence. And if you have that musical type of ability, you'll learn it much faster than someone who doesn't. So which proved to be true, and I found that fascinating. Of course, we read in the Bible about how the morning stars all sang together. Would love to know what that sounded like. But it reminds me, a few years ago, David Lopez came across something on the internet where some scientists recorded crickets chirping, very high pitch, very rapid, and they slowed the sounds way down and combined them, and it actually was playing musical, harmonious music. It wasn't just one note, it was harmony. There's no telling how much music is all around us that we have no capacity to be aware of. But it's absolutely everywhere, and like Buddy said, preceded us.
Yeah.
My comment is much more simple and not, I just made a connection to a poem, 17th century poem by John Dryden entitled Alexander's Feast. And in that poem, he is talking about the moment at which Alexander the Great has conquered Persia. And they are celebrating. And Timotheus, who is the musician, plays at this feast. And it's interesting that Timotheus is able to control Alexander's emotions. And so you have the great Alexander being controlled by the musician. The musician takes him through all of these different emotions, sadness to weeping, and then anger, and then love, and all of these different emotions. It was just a connection I made when you were talking about the emotional connections with music.
Kind of like David and Saul. Or
You ever listen to Shostakovich's Leningrad Symphony? I mean, you can hear almost the burning of the city and the great emotions of the war. So, no accident there. But yeah, there's some connections that we don't completely understand, which goes to our design. So, any other questions, comments, sir?
Fascinates me that atheists can listen to a composition by Mozart, be moved, and even might say he's inspired. My question is, of course, those who are members of Churches of Christ typically don't believe in instrumental music as part of worship. Why should we be opposed to it if it actually produces this kind of effect of, in a good way, a beautiful way of stimulating emotions and that kind of thing? What would you say in reply to something like that?
That's a good question. Well, and I know there's probably a great many people in here who could probably answer that better than me, but I'll give my 2 cents, I guess. Authenticity in worship obviously should be always a big deal. And I think we see, especially the way music is used in maybe some modern churches today, it becomes less about the worship and it becomes more about maybe just feelings, anything, feeling something, feeling sad, maybe not any connection to the divine. And that's I think a degradation of the beauty that music gives. And also, it may just be personal preference. Modern Christian music just isn't very good a lot of the time. I don't think it is very beautiful a lot of the time. And again, that just gets down to personal preference, and that's a whole other issue. But yeah, I guess from my limited perspective, I would say an argument to be made for that would be, don't, if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off. Don't allow for that kind of, I guess, misuse of something that could be good. Don't allow for the provision of it. I just personally am not one of those who is just staunchly, music should never be used in worship, and if it is, I'm just going to be unbelievably horrified about that. I think it is more often than not misused in worship, probably. And I probably have a lot more to learn about that. But and you can see it became an issue very early on in the church, was whether that should be used or not. So I am not one to promote instrumental music in worship, but I wouldn't necessarily condemn it just because it's instrumental worship. That probably doesn't mean anything, but just because it's my opinion. But that's just my opinion.
Well, now that we know what goes on at 58th Street, I mean, it goes beyond biblical authority. That's the foundation we rest on, and that's good enough. And it wasn't a question for 600 years, near as we know. And then somebody decided that an instrument would be a good thing, but it clearly was not used in New Testament worship based on the examples that we have. And that's the ground we stand on. At least that's the ground I stand on. So if you're rolling a piano, I'm leaving. And I mean that seriously. So don't roll on a piano. At least not during worship. So that's, yeah, I'm glad, Tom. I know where you all stand on it. I'm going to write that one down. Questions, comments, further?
Well, that's when you said authenticity, you meant we need to have authority for what we do.
Right, yes.
That's how you started, so that's where we need to stay on that issue.
Absolutely. And a lot of that I read just from some early church people is that instrumental music was used a lot in pagan temple worship and in pagan theater. So they wanted to stay as far away from that as possible, obviously, too. So.
And obviously, people reach back to the Old Testament and say, well, David used to.
Right.
You know those things. So that's, of course, they also had animal sacrifice. So. Anything else? All right, well, thank you very much, Micah. Well, that does bring us to a close, and it brings us to the close of the academic year. So we are glad that you're here tonight. Hope that you have a good end of the year. If you're a student amongst us, if you're not, remember them as they finish the semester next week. And next fall, Lord willing, we'll have another set of honors evenings, and we'll look forward to seeing you then. And those will be published ahead of time as these were. So with that, thank you again for being here and supporting these students, and we wish you a good night.